We're here today at the Mettle booth at NAB 2017. We are Legend VR. My name is Ryan Cummins. I'm a virtual reality and visual effects supervisor.
And my name is Mike Hopkinson. I'm also a virtual reality supervisor.
And what we do here at Legend is kind of a full VR production house. We started back in 2014. We started out in the post-production, went through, figured out how to do stitching for monoscopic, stereoscopic, and started kind of figuring out the different puzzle pieces from a visual effects standpoint for VR. Then over the years, we started doing more and more on-set supervision, physical production, because we realized clients really valued our advice and our opinion on helping out how to plan things. And then ultimately, we landed all the way up on the front end with creative development of helping how to tell your story in VR and proper choices to make in pre-production before we go through. And so now, we kind of do anything and everything that they need. And also, if they only need a very specific piece, we're very modular. We can kind of plug in where everyone needs us.
We'll give you guys a breakdown in terms of our strategy when we're approaching new jobs, working with the client, educating them, letting them know the limitations within this medium, and also what we can provide as a high-quality virtual reality studio.
Yeah.
So real quick, we'll play the demo reel here for you guys to check out some of the work that we've done in case you guys have seen some of it.
Yeah, it's about 3 minutes long. It's going to cover the majority of the projects we've done in about the last 2.5 years to kind of give you a background on some of the things that we've done and also a better understanding of some of the topics that we're going to cover in our talk today, and then ultimately answer additional questions at the end. So that was our latest reel that has the bulk of our projects on it. You've seen a handful of things from commercial branding, Art of Patron, music videos for Apple Music, Muse Revolt. We saw a little bit of CG with Crimson Peak and the Universe piece. Yeah, the famous Stan Lee in there with his Cosmic Crusader. So we've done quite a bit of things from live action, full CG, visual effects, stereo conversion, native stereo stitch, and we've kind of hit the gamut of anything you can do on the pre-rendered side. And so part of what we're going to talk about today is a lot of the experience that we've gotten from all of those projects. Some of them have specific case studies, and then ultimately in the end, because we have a little bit more time today here at the Mettle booth, we'll be able to go through a little bit more in depth on any particular questions you have in general, or any particular questions you have related to one of the pieces you saw in the reel.
Okay, so why VR? When people come to us and they want to do something, we always kind of ask that question. It might seem pretty simple, but it really makes you think about a lot of things, right? And this is where we kind of enlighten the client in terms of things to expect when you're working in 360. It's not exactly the same as working in a traditional format. The timeline's different, the budget's a little bit different, your deliverables are different, the market's way different. So since this is such a new thing, a lot of people that come to us are super new to this. I mean, we have a lot of recurring clients that have, like Here Be Dragons and a couple big brands that absolutely know what they're doing, but a lot of the times we get people calling us up that have heard about VR and they want to do something with it. So we'll ultimately start with, why do you want to be in this space, and kind of nurture that narrative a little bit, because when it comes down to it, all this stuff is, if you have a good story, you most likely will have a good outcome. It's just as long as you don't have too many distractions along the way in terms of bad stitching or any of the other little inefficiencies and things that can happen if you accelerate your process and don't strategically go through the process of VR filmmaking. So something that's important to talk about is ultimately, what is the experience going to be playing on? There's actually a big difference between 360 and virtual reality that a lot of people kind of throw the two terms together often, and they're both vastly different. So to hit the masses of people, there's a Google Cardboard version where you can put it to people's cell phones, where they can have a window into the world and use their phone to look around. You can put it into a cardboard to get a little bit of, get some stereo. However, your interactive capabilities will be limited when you're using a cell phone processor. When I mean interactive capabilities, it's when you're watching a video, what else can you do?
Gaze-based triggering. If you step up from the cardboard and hop into a slightly more integrated headset, such as the Samsung Gear, you have a touchpad on the side, or with the new release, you get a remote, same with the Google Daydream. But from there, it's still a little bit limited. You get a little bit more immersive feeling if it happens to be in stereo. And then the step up from there is going into more of the processor-heavy, tethered headsets. We have the Starbreeze, the Rift, the Vive, and those are usually ran in a real-time game engine, and it gives you the ability to walk around because there's positional head tracking, and there's kind of two different versions even of that. There's more of the interactive narrative where it's not necessarily gamey and you're not grabbing things and throwing things and triggering stuff. It's more of a passive experience where you're still being told a story, but it feels more realistic because things parallax and you can move around a bit. So it's still a passive experience, but it's an upgraded one. And then ultimately, the furthest big one is the full kind of gamified real-time engines, where not only do you have a little bit of that parallax and movement, but you're also interacting with elements or other characters and triggering things and going from there. And so when we first meet with a client, we talk about, what are your goals? It's like a traditional creative agency when they're making commercial. What are you guys trying to do? Why VR? Are you guys trying to sell something? Are you guys trying to get an emotional response out of someone? Are you wanting to make a really cool kind of hype piece for your company, showing that you're involved in the newest technology? And once we've kind of narrowed down what their goal is, then we talk about what is it that we can make with this experience that caters to VR that won't be better in just traditional media. Why VR? Like, I want to do a car commercial. Okay, well, what is it about this car commercial that's going to take advantage of 360 video or VR versus just shooting it traditionally? And once we've kind of aligned ourselves with the clients of what their ultimate goals are, then we can start trying to make a strategy and a plan of which of those routes from the extremely passive to the very interactive is the best to go down to accomplish that. And then we can start educating them on the reasoning behind why we can do this, why we can't do that, and ultimately why the strategy we're putting together for them is the best bang for their buck right now.
And also kind of going a little bit more into that, with fully interactive stuff, most people, that's what they want, right? But there's also like a reality to that. If you want to have something that's fully interactive with an Oculus, how many people have an Oculus at home with a VR-ready computer that want to consume this content. Yeah, there's people that are out there, but when it comes to like a commercial market from an ad agency standpoint, that's not really the mass of the market that they're looking for. So this is when we'll bring up that, there's a lot of new installation pieces that are coming out. Like IMAX VR has a big facility in Los Angeles that is fantastic, where you can go and have installations there where people can go and almost buy tickets and sign up. I know HTC Vive is doing a similar thing by setting up centers across the country in almost like an arcade sort of way to kind of give people the tools that they need to help consume the best content out there, while not having to spend thousands of dollars on an ideal setup.
Yeah, and kind of go back to that, depending on what they have in their head, everyone that comes from a traditional media standpoint is used to high definition, now HDR, 4K TVs in your home. So everybody has a certain mindset of the way images look to them nowadays, and then we get to VR and it's a whole different ball game from them. If they're traditional media and they want to go full interactive, then they're going to have to understand and be taught how game engines work and how we have to reduce textures and polygons to get it all run in real time. And they walk up to us and say, we want super photoreal, it has to look absolutely real, and it has to be super interactive. And we're like, okay, well currently these are the limitations, this is what's possible or not. And we'll ultimately kind of guide them. If you want absolute photoreal, where you actually have real people in it, maybe it's better to go down the 360 video route, or we have new cameras coming out that allow you to do volumetric, so that makes the interactive realism a little bit more possible. And so we kind of have to go through and figure out and extract and distill information from them to ultimately present them whatever is going to be best for what they're after visually, but also from the distribution side of how they want to do it. So that leads them to creative development, thinking in 360. We've got a plan, we know kind of what they want to do, we know how it's going to be distributed, and ultimately what devices it's going to be played on. So now we actually meet with either if they already have a director or a creative director on the client side, and we start planning out the creative. They ultimately either have an idea of the type of story they want to tell, and it's our job to make that a reality within 360. So we start talking about things about how close you want to pull people to the camera and have them look you in the eyes, or what it feels like to be flying or driving a car and doing different things, and how to take whatever their normal ideas that they're thinking of in a framed space and open the frame and really expand it into a 360 space that can take advantage of all the different nuances from a visual standpoint as well as an audio one. So that way we can create and craft the best 360 or VR experience for them.
This is where we'll also strategize how we're going to be shooting this thing. There's obviously a bunch of different cameras out there and a bunch of different ways to put this stuff together. So strategically speaking, for example, the Days of Empathy project, that was one where we established that shooting something nodally was going to ultimately be the best way to go about that job, both in terms of timeline, getting a perfect stitch, and also working with a director that's used to shooting traditionally. Because there's a lot of people that are cinematographers that work on features and directors that work on commercials that are excellent storytellers that want to come into this medium, but there's a lot to learn before you just hop into a virtual reality set with a spherical camera and you have to start hiding from it and start hiding your rigging and everything like that. It gets a little stressful for some people. So oftentimes if people have that traditional background, this is when we'll strategize with them to try and create an environment on set that matches a normal way that they're used to shooting. When you shoot nodally, you can actually set up video village, you can set up your lights, you can have crew in the room. The director can sit right by the talent and actually give directing notes while shooting. You don't have to just exit out of the room and hide from the camera. You get normal playback, you get a raw workflow. There's so many benefits to shooting nodally, but there's a lot of planning that goes into it, and this is the stage when we kind of strategically put that together.
Yeah, and then ultimately, like you were talking about, for the Dave Empathy piece, Left Behind, we specifically chose Nodal, but there's been other instances where the director says, I want to move the camera and I want to fly this drone, and we're like, okay. So we're now going to go to the 360 setup, and then depending on how much time we have for schedule, budget, can we afford to do stitching with our artists in-house? Does it need to run through the cloud? Because the turnaround time is so critical that once we kind of get that story and that initial storyboard and blocking laid down, then we move into pre-production. And for VR, pre-production is literally worth its weight in gold. In our eyes, it's much more valuable in VR than it is in traditional media. The idea, the best way that we convey it to the clients is think about how much time and money and the improvement in quality of the piece when you do pre-production on something that's literally going to be framed and sitting on a TV. Now multiply all those savings by breaking the frame and wrapping that image fully around you. It's exponential, the benefits of it. Not only that, but if it's their first time getting into it and the technology is constantly evolving, you have to constantly keep up on your toes and trying new things, and you may end up being the first person to ever do a particular thing on a project, and so you need even more pre-production because there aren't necessarily established best practices that we've been doing for the last 30 years. That's just the way that everybody does it. And so pre-production in VR is, in our eyes, even more valuable. And originally, not as many companies and brands and agencies were wanting to spend the money on it because VR was so new, the budgets were so much smaller. So they were kind of like, no, we got this idea, we got this camera rig, we're going to go shoot it. We may or may not want you on set. We might just tell you about it, bring you the footage afterwards, and then you assemble it and piece it together. That happened enough times to where we told him, here it is, it's done. Just so you know, for next time, if we had done A, B, and C, we could have finished it a week earlier and saved you a quarter of your budget. And from some of that feedback and continuing the education, even after we finished the project, they started realizing that it was better to do more pre-production and get us involved more and more on the front end, so that way you ultimately end up with a better story, better visuals, and you end up having a much higher chance of delivering on time and on budget, which is super important for VR right now, because a lot of companies that are wanting to dabble and get into it, if they get into VR and they have a really great first experience and they have an amazing product and everything went smooth as it can be for VR, they'll ultimately want to continue down that route and dive further and further into VR, versus if a client's the first time they ever want to do VR, they're very hesitant on it, and it goes over budget, it doesn't deliver on time, they're much less likely to continue possibly diving down that route.
And this is even more relative once people, because people come to us, they want stitching, sometimes conversion to 3D, and then a final deliverable. But oftentimes if people want some visual effects, if we want like any sort of modeling or lighting or rigging, graphics, like establishing these like a milestone schedule, not like once we have a stitch, we're down the line, let's create a little model, a little drone to just add in there. Like, then you have iterations of making sure your model is approved. You got to go through look development. Then that whole process of VFX has to be established up front. And again, like I said, like the timeline for these projects is so short. So it's really important that if they want those things, to kind of establish that up front and get all the references and all that stuff kind of aligned on the creative level before moving forward to execute anything.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, every single VR project, regardless of what it is visual effects. Whether you're shooting cameras just to get a frame. Say there's no CG or motion graphics in the entire project's still a visual effects project from start to finish, because you're having to assemble and stitch and piece together all those cameras. Same thing once you hop into the CG route. So as much planning as possible that can go into it, you'll ultimately end up with a better product. Like we talked about camera choices, here's an example of 3 different types of cameras. Over here on the left, we have the latest volumetric light field camera from Lytro called Emerge. This was a recent photo from their announcement of the next version. The top right, obviously, is Nokia Ozo. You've probably seen it. They're here this week at NAB. And then down in the bottom right corner is a Red Dragon rig on a Nodal setup, to where it's just a single camera. And the differences of these, every camera has pros and cons, and part of the, client alignment, education, and pre-production is figuring out what's going to be best for the project. Not necessarily what's going to be the cheapest or fit within schedule, different things, but what's going to be best. What are your top criteria? Because everything has a pro and a con to it right now, because the cameras, there is no perfect camera, and they're constantly changing and evolving. So we ask them, what's the 3 most important things to you? Being able to move the camera, having the best color, having it in stereo, and based on their choices of what's the most important to them, we will kind of choose a strategy and a package for the camera that's going to best suit that. And whether it be a volumetric light field, a multi-camera system, or a nodal setup, it's ultimately going to be driven by what they're trying to achieve.
So now for this slide, it's a case study for a project called Left Behind that we worked on. Although it's labeled physical production, I'm still going to touch a little bit upon the pre-production we did for this project, because it's a really good example of, again, being strategic at the front end. The director of this piece, her name is Wendy Calhoun. She works on the show Empire. She comes from a traditional television background. She got hired on this job to work on a virtual reality set, was a little bit intimidated, but again, she's an excellent storyteller. She knows exactly how to engage an audience. So coming from a director standpoint, that's exactly what we could always ask for. Let us do the figuring out in terms of how you're going to approach this thing in a virtual setting. So she came to us with a traditional script and kind of wanted to ask us, the budget was, it was
It's pretty good.
It's pretty good. It was fairly low, so we wanted to keep things, you know, as realistic as possible. So, as we all know, stitching is always a necessary evil that we have to do right now, but it's, you know, it's thankfully because of software and hardware that's out there, people are starting to figure that one out. But we're still not quite there yet. So, off the bat, we established that if we could cut out the stitching, we could shoot in a particular way that didn't involve using a spherical setup. So, you can see in this image here, we're actually setting up a red dragon, which is a traditional camera, and we wanted to shoot it nodally. So basically when you're shooting nodally, you have separate quadrants that you're shooting individually. You're not shooting everything at once. It's not one of these it's not like an OZA where you just press record, everything records at the same time. It's more or less where I'd have a camera, you know, here with a 85 millimeter, not 85 millimeter, like a wider lens, and I'm shooting this quadrant first, and I'm able to shoot with a red camera, so you have a completely raw workflow. You can shoot it traditionally from a director. You can stand behind the camera and look at your subjects. Also on this project, there were kids that she had to direct, so it was super important that she was like in the room with these kids because they were really young and they required
constant supervision.
Constant supervision and direction, for sure. Directing kids is a tough one. So based on that, we were able to break out her script with every single scene, what's in our north, what's in our east, what's our south, what's our west. So she could, from there, start to kind of visualize what the scene's gonna look like, while Ryan and I could start to figure out, okay, for this shot, we're gonna have 4 quadrants, right? We have A, B, C, D, so how are we gonna do this? So when we were on set, that's where having us being there to supervise is pretty important, so we can actually map out exactly where the camera's gonna go, because when you're shooting something nodally, like the camera cannot move. If you shoot a plate, if it gets nudged or you make a different decision later, you have to shoot everything all over again. So it takes a lot of time, especially if you're not strategic at all. So here's a couple still images of us on set. So you can see here on our top right image, there's actually people standing on set, which is funny for a virtual reality shoot, right? But here we're mapping out our quadrants. We're actually calculating where for those of you who don't know what nodal shooting is, it's calculating the sensor size you're shooting on and also the focal distance of the lens that you're using, and then you calculate where there's a no parallax point in any glass that's out there. You know, there's a film plane where the actual image is being captured, but in front of that there's an actual point where the image is converging in the lens. So if you can find that point and map that as being like your center axis, then if you shoot here and then I rotate and shoot this way, there's actually no parallax difference between your plates, and that's why when you go to stitch, it's a perfect solve. You never have to worry about parallax differences from sensors being, at different angles, and it really just, again, it accelerates our process. Like we went from shooting for a couple days, and then when we were in our facility, we had this whole thing stitched in like a half day, because it just required coming up with a quick template out of PT GUI and just undistorting everything, stitching it, and it was like a 100% solve. Didn't have a single stitch note for the rest of the project, which never happens when you stitch projects, right?
The flip side to that, though, going back to why we want to do certain things in certain ways, is requires much more planning, much more pre-production up front, but then the post-process is much quicker. The schedule allowed for that, and part of outside of the post being quicker, the main reason, or an additional reason that we went this route is because went through the checklist with her. What's most important to you? She came from a traditional media. She wanted quality. She wanted color. And so based on the different camera options we gave her, and we talked about multi-camera setups, different versions of them, different nodal setups, and ultimately based on the qualifications that she wanted, we went with the nodal setup. And then we had to make slight adjustments to the script for the blocking of the action of the characters, which, like Mike said, on the top right-hand side was double checking that blocking to make sure that in the quadrant with the bench, you could see everything that you needed, including other characters coming in, and there was enough space. And then we checked the additional areas for the playground and whatnot. And then, like Mike said, it's so precise, which goes back to that kind of precision in the pre-production planning, that we knew on the bottom image and the one on the left, we were inside the visitor room of a prison. And you were going to be from the assumption of a daughter seeing her mother across the visitor table. So we know we needed to lower the camera to, about the eye height of a child, so you felt a little smaller and the adults felt bigger. But then also, ultimately, we wanted you sitting in the chair. We wanted you to feel a little bit grounded, because not only were you going to be lower from a child's height, but you also needed to be sitting. So while looking down, if there was no chair, you were going to feel extremely short because you were seated in nothing. So from the nodal standpoint, we had to do some trigonometry, so that way the nodal heads for these larger cameras are very big. And so what we end up having to do is take very precise measurements of where the nodal point of the red system was, so that way once we moved it off to the side, slid the plate down and aimed the camera down to capture both a reference plate for the ground for a clean plate, as well as the chair, that it still would line up in the stitch, so that way the post was still as quick as possible in the end. And so there's a lot more calculations, data collection, pre-planning in that, but if you do it correctly, in the end, it's ultimately going to be a lot smoother on post. Last part about the nodal rig, as great as it is, if the director really wants to move the camera, most likely you're not going to be able to do it because the quadrants have to line up. Mike mentioned that if you barely nudge it, it's going to throw everything off. Lock-off shoots is very easy. You can get a really wide-angle lens, so you can still allow for lots of movement with the characters, but if you need to move the camera, ultimately you're going to need to go through a motion control rig that you can program out the exact movement to be repeated over and over again through the quadrants. So that means limited restrictions. You can't do a drone, you can't do certain cable cams, so you start getting a little bit more limited in the movement. But for this piece, everything was going to be a lock-off, so it was an easy choice. So we're done on set, we've shot everything, we've gathered all the data, we have all the cameras, we have all the plates, we have all the references, we have all the decisions of, while Mike and I are on set, we're constantly having conversations with both the director, the DP, and each other about, is there anything that's concerning you as you're watching it that you might want to fix later? Oh, we know you chose that select, but there was an issue because somebody went too far outside the seam. So Mike and I make mental notes of that's shots where you have to start earlier than others in post because that one's going to be a little bit trickier now. Talking about the DP of, is there anything he needs to kind of enhance or alter in the lighting in the end? So we take all the knowledge and information and discussions that we had while we were on set to start planning out the post-production. Two big aspects of that. There's the plate preparation and then the actual visual effects. When we get to plate preparation, it serves two purposes. One is to ensure that the stitch is ultimately going to be as clean as possible, but even more important is in the end, the final transcoding and compression is going to be as clean as possible. We all know right now that even if you shoot with a 12K plate, ultimately it's going to get compressed down and down-resed and encoded into something that's a lot smaller and playable on either the tethered or the mobile headsets. So we know that no matter how nice our images are or how large the resolution, ultimately they're going to have to come down. And so part of the plate preparation is ensuring that all of the cameras are as clean and as nice and as stable and as beautifully colored as possible, so that way once they run through the stitch process and visual effects, that the end final lat long will be as nice as it can be for when that final compression and coating does. We have to go through, make sure if it's a moving camera that the cameras are synced. Some camera systems are gen locked, some are not, so we have to go through and make sure it's synced. On lock-off shots, it's not as important if you don't have people walking through the seams because you can't necessarily tell if there's a few frames off between the cameras. If you have someone walking through the seam, you can tell they kind of stutter or pop because the two cameras aren't exactly aligned in time. Especially in moving cameras. If you have a drone that's moving through the sky and all of a sudden the rear camera is kind of behind and kind of bouncing because it's not moving the same as the other. So you go through and you make sure all the cameras are synced. Depending on the camera type, you might have subframe offsets, which means the different cameras drift, that you can never properly sync them no matter how you try. So you just kind of assess it and triage it as need be. If you're shooting native, you have to go do stereo corrections. A big issue when people have bad VR experiences isn't always the story. Part of it is the story. Part of it is the kind of like the assault on their eyeballs. They put a headset on, the stereo is really big, really in their face. There's differences between the eyes, things aren't aligned properly, the color's different, so they don't know exactly what it is, but they know it hurts their eyes and they immediately want to take a headset off. So part of that is going through, before we do anything else, making those stereo corrections, balancing the color between the eyes, doing any vertical alignment to make sure that it's as nice and as matching as possible before we feed it through the rest of the process. It includes color balancing, low light scenarios with noise reduction. There are certain cameras that are getting better shooting low light. The Sony a7S, the Jaunt one's pretty good at it. They're getting better and better, but until we have really great cameras for VR shooting low light, it's a good chance it's going to be pretty noisy. And we know if the noisier the plates are, the more compression artifacts and chattering our final transcode's going to be. So it goes back to the noise reduction. If it's just a single shot, we might do it in Nuke. If it's multiple shots across the whole edit, that's one of the things that we use the Mettle plugin for, is we'll have in editorial shots called out that need noise reduction. If there's enough of them, we'll just use some of the Mettle tools to quickly go through and tag them through the edit and the cut. Then we'll render it out, watch it. If any of them need further refinement, then we'll go from there. The last part, rolling shutter. Some camera systems have a global shutter, help solve that. Not all of them do. And because you want to be fully immersed, you can't have one camera that's constantly kind of flickering, because it really throws you out of the experience. Here's a quick image from the Art of Patron that we did. Just a few little examples of the different plate preparation issues. We have an exposure difference in one camera where it's a lot darker. We ended up having a camera sync issue on the back where once the two gentlemen walking through a seam kind of popped and stuttered. We had a really bad rolling shutter. This was shot on GoPros, by the way. We had a really bad rolling shutter issue over the sun, where it was constantly just flickering and rolling through, and it kept catching your attention because it was kind of in your upper right-hand corner. And then ultimately, as we're prepping the plates, we're thinking in our heads, what's down the line? Are we adding visual effects? Do we need to stabilize it? The majority of Patron was shot on a drone, so we knew we needed to stabilize it. So as we're prepping the plates and starting to align everything up, we're constantly thinking what's the next step and how we're going to approach it. Last aspect, gone through, planned it, shot it, started the stitch, got the plates prepped. Depending on the different aspects of visual effects, we don't have everything listed. Parts of the visual effects pipeline are still very similar to traditional media. Certain aspects of the visual effects pipeline are largely different. So we're going to cover some of the larger differences that's kind of new to where if a client has to think about it, or as a visual effects artist getting into 360 VR, different approaches and different mindsets that you have to think about. So at the beginning, asset generation, same as always. You've got CG assets that need to be built, modeled, textured rig, look dev. Meanwhile, 2D is stitching everything together, painting out the rigs, and prepping the plates so that way we can combine them later. Camera tracking and match moving. This is a big one. Traditionally, you're shooting a camera, tracking one thing, recreating it, drop the CG in, then we get to VR. So we've got multiple cameras facing multiple directions. Their sensors are all spaced out. They may or may not be synced. They might have some drift between them, and you are trying to track a camera that can then represent the sphere and the piece as a whole to where you can drop CG anywhere and everywhere. Two different mindsets of doing it. If you need to do lots of CG, you need to try and get a track that's as stable and as solid as possible for the entire 360 sphere. Sometimes, depending on the types of moves and if there was issues with the cameras, that's not necessarily possible. So another option is very strategically planning out where does your CG need to live and making sure that a track really holds up well in that aspect of the sphere, but not necessarily the rest of it.
Yeah, because the tricky part about tracking a lat-long image that's stitched is that it's stitched, so it's already not a true plate, right? So anytime you try to run something like that through any sort of a camera tracker that's not even used to the distortion that you get with equirectangular, it throws it off. So we've had to do a number of things, even to taking it a step back and tracking each of the cameras individually.
Yeah, we've done multiple things. We've tracked each camera individually because of very specific things. We've tracked the thing as a whole in 360. We've rendered out essentially a portion of it in a rectilinear format to then track specifically on that, so that it's more like a traditional track. And then ultimately, in our studio, we use Synthize. Ross Anderson's actually next door with us, and the last update of Synthize that he introduced actually included 360 tracking capabilities. So we no longer had to pre-render a rectilinear plate out just to bring it in, just to do a track. You can now actually section it off and track it in there. And so technologies and different softwares are constantly improving to make it better and better, because they know that's kind of a big pain point, because as these experiences are supposed to feel immersive and real, nothing throws you off as you're moving through and all of a sudden a CG geometry starts sliding behind you and next to you, and it kind of throws you off.
Mocha is another good one for that too. Mocha's 360 tools that just came out, it's an excellent tracking tool, especially for their traditional removes, but now you can kind of swap back and forth between tracking in equirectangular to rectilinear. Everything's in real time, so it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. And we get into animation. So obviously from animation standpoint, it's a little bit different because the viewer and the point of view of the camera and how close you are and how you kind of feel immersed, animators have to think about it a little bit differently because you're a lot closer to certain subtleties if it's close up that maybe when you sit in a movie theater and the screen's far away, you might not notice as well. And usually the animators that we've worked with, we have camera setups in Maya now that we kind of hop in and out of different points of view, where you're from the point of view of the camera so you can see exactly how it's facing, but then you also can immediately hop out and see them from a perspective view to make sure that even if it looks correct on the screen but something slightly off, you don't hop to the side and someone's neck stretched way out. And then we get to lighting. Same thing as the physical production. Lighting is very important because you no longer have lighting off the side of the screen. You can no longer have a kicker or a big volumetric light race coming off from the side of the frame because it has to truly exist. In the 360 experience, someone should be able to see, okay, there's a really strong light and volume rays coming from over here. I'm going to look up and actually see that light source. So whether it's physical production or CG, everything has to make sense because everything has to be connected back to its origin point. And then finally, when we get into integration, we're taking all the different aspects, whether it's motion graphics that we've generated using Mettle and After Effects, or it's CG that we've used in Maya and Houdini. We got to put them all together and combine them with our stitched plates. And we get into different aspects of that because a lot of the software and technology that's built today that we use wasn't necessarily originally built for 360. So a lot of the tools cause different seams in the back and pinches at the top and the bottom, and so you're always kind of being mindful of when you kind of break something. But a lot of tools in Nuke and After Effects and Mettle are allowing us to kind of take those assets and drop them in properly, because what you ultimately want is not only to set and integrate whatever it is in there, but once you're in a 360 space, you want to make sure that it's properly sitting in a spherical space and that the perspective doesn't look off or wrong because you try to just merge something over and it doesn't actually flow correctly through the equirectangular image.
Right. Compositing for equirectangular is definitely, I would think, the biggest one. If you're a traditional compositor trying to come into this medium for the first time, like working in that unwrapped sphere is pretty difficult. It's not impossible. There's a lot of tools that are out there. We use Nuke to do a lot of our spherical transforms to kind of work within that realm, but you can see in this next slide, I mean, even with our original demo, you'll see how things get so distorted at the tops and bottoms of the screen. So being able to take these CG elements and integrate them with proper tracking and have it look right is, it's aggressive.
Yeah, and we have different tools along different aspects. We believe in, it's not the one tool that solves all, because VR is so constantly evolving and changing that we look at it as whatever is going to be the best tool for this particular project or this particular department. Like, we use Mettle heavily on our editorial side for quick orientation changes, quick denoises, quick throwing of title cards, credits, mock-ups for things, because it's so fast and iterative versus us going through, say, our main compositing pipeline with Nuke and baking the elements in and waiting for it to process on the render farm. And so every time we approach a new project, there's usually something new. Whether we've figured out a new way to solve something in our existing software, or we're trying out a new software technology for the first time, everything's constantly changing and evolving, from the techniques and the workflows and the ideas to the actual technology that's supporting it. And once you're done with all the rest of the stuff, we get down to the very end. You have your final image. What's the best way to kind of go through it, QC it both internally as well as get it to the client and get their feedback? Because a lot of these VR projects have shorter, more commercial type turnarounds, and there's already enough issues and hurdles that you have to get throughout the production process that getting to final deliverables and getting that final client buy off is just another thing to add to the list. So what we like to do is kind of approach it from a big to small, most egregious, what's going to harm the story, and then just kind of go from there. Me personally, the way I do it is we use RV because it's really nice. It can cache really well for large data sets because we have shots that can be up to 8,000 frames in stereo, so you're actually caching 16,000 4K frames at once. So we need something that can play back really well and let us scrub through the shots. And we'll take first glance at the full unwrapped lat log. And all we're doing is taking a glance, taking a step back, big picture, what breaks, what catches our attention, what large egregious errors are there. Because I don't want to just start hopping into a headset and nitpicking every single thing, because that ultimately could potentially waste time and money for our artists and ultimately the clients. So we go from big picture issues, go through a few rounds of that. Once it looks pretty good on a full unwrap, then we'll hop into a rectilinear view that tries to simulate a virtual camera to kind of see what it would look like in a headset. Scroll around a bit there, see if anything large stands out to you as you start panning kind of your initial field of views of the storyline and most likely what the end user will look through. Ultimately from there, that looks good. Pop it into a headset, take a look at it, follow the story. Instead of trying to get nitpicky with everything, follow along. We put ourselves in the user's experience. Does everything make sense? Does anything catch our eyes? If we do see things, we'll talk about it and discuss it. Because ultimately, if something very important is in front of you and you're catching this little pop behind you on the floor, we have much larger issues because you missed the big point of the story.
Yeah, there's always, every time we've done a project, there's always something we'd want to go back and tweak. I think that's the nature of probably everyone that's here working in this.
Especially with the visual effects background.
Yeah. So like Ryan kind of said, it's just like an iterative process, right? We kind of start with that equirectangle just to get like the overall look to see what's egregious, and it's kind of just taking like these snackable steps all the way until our final delivery to see, how good we can make this image.
And we ultimately try and get it to the director as soon as possible because we know, everybody watches things differently. You put 10 people in a headset, everyone watches the exact same piece, everyone's going to have a completely different experience coming out of it. And so we know ultimately it's going to be how the director feels about it and how the agency or the client or the brand feels about it. And so as soon as we kind of get the largest, most egregious things on our end that's kind of, not embarrassing to show the director, we'll send it to them or invite them in and have them go through it with us and say, from your perspective, what catches your eyes? It's just like traditional VFX where the VFX soup and the director and the client all want to get aligned. So that way, is the color, is it the stitch, is it the CG, what's the most important aspects of it? So that way we're focusing on what's going to get the shots and the piece approved and out the door and not just nitpicking every single thing. And that is it from us.
That's a wrap.